World Bank report says that 2% of India's GDP will be lost by 2050, and this is not just for heat but also all the climate-related impacts. And if you look at labor exposure to heat, it's by 2030 ILO says 4.8% of working hours are going to be lost, which can truly be a big picture scenario, because this can lead to almost 340 million jobs, equivalent of 340 million jobs being lost by 2030.
23 Kharghar, there was this massive event which was organized in an open field in Kharghar in Navi Mumbai, where about 13 people died from a heat stroke. And it was only after that incident that a weather station got installed in Kharghar. Before that, the closest weather station there was, which could accurately predict, was more than 30 kilometers away. With weather changing every 6 kilometers, it could not really predict that area would have a heat wave.
One of the boldest recommendations in our report is creating a targeted cooling program for the most vulnerable. Just to put the entire focus on cooling rather than talking about heat, let's envision a future, or rather a present.
Extreme heat is a familiar reality for many in India, but climate change is turning known heat into a crippling crisis. It's already impacting our health, straining our infrastructure, threatening agricultural productivity, and affecting virtually every aspect of our lives. The critical question then becomes, how prepared are we as a nation for this monumental challenge that we are enduring right now? And more importantly, what can be done? To delve into this issue and explore solutions, we are joined today to discuss a groundbreaking new report by the Sustainable Futures Collaborative titled, Is India Ready for a Warming World? This pioneering research highlights the preparedness of 9 key Indian cities, collectively representing 11% of our urban population, in the face of increasing heat, and importantly, recommends vital strategies to deal this crisis. And to help us navigate this discussion, we have with us Tamanna Dalal, a senior research associate, and Skandita Tiwari, a research associate. Both are part of the Adaptation and Resilience Department at the SFC and co authors of this important report. Thank you so much, Tamanna and Skandita, for joining this conversation. It's a pleasure to have you both here.
Thank you, Anirudh, for having us.
Yeah, it's really great.
Can we begin this conversation by first understanding what really heat waves are and why are they becoming such a significant concern? And then maybe we can delve into your research later.
Yeah, sure. So heat waves are such a new phenomenon if you look at the policy space, right? In very simple terms, heat waves are an extended period of time when temperatures go beyond the usual temperatures that the particular place has experienced. Now, this is where I think a lot of unpacking needs to be done. A heat wave is not the same as a hot day. So not every hot day can be declared as a heat wave. For a heat wave to be declared, a threshold has to be designated, and the threshold is now a scientifically declared threshold that takes into account a lot of local factors. For example, a 40-degree day in Delhi might be a heat wave, but a 40-degree day in another very unusually hot place might not be declared as a heat wave. Now, a lot of factors go into it. For example, just the bare minimum temperature, surely. But what truly plays a role here is humidity. So, for example, when you think about a city like Mumbai, so a 35 degree in Mumbai with humidity levels of 70 or 50% will be declared as a heat wave, while the same 35 degrees is not a heat wave in Delhi. And it's sort of based on a historical understanding of temperatures where detrimental impacts start coming up with respect to public health or the economy overall.
And yeah, please go ahead.
No, I wanted Skandita to take the impacts thing, if you want to take it.
Yeah, I think when we look at heat wave impacts, I think we should take a step back and then just think about why heat waves are occurring in the first place and why they are rising, right? And then you link all of it back to climate change, how historical emissions have led to carbon being trapped in the atmosphere, which has led to temperatures rise. I think in 2024 it was the first time that we breached the 1.5 degree threshold. And heat as in itself, its nature, it's changing. So heat is not the same as, it's not the same heat as what it was maybe 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago. Heat is, it's becoming much more dangerous, much more threatening. It's coming in earlier, it is lasting much more longer. I remember last year it was until I think November that we had AC switched on because it was just so hot here in Delhi. Similar for so many other places in the country. So because of the number of heat wave days which are rising, there's an increase in the intensity of the heat waves. Because of that, hundreds of people are dying everywhere. And it's a pan-India phenomena, is how we understand it. Every place is being affected differently. There are variations in geography, there are variations on the basis of local contexts, etc. It's very, as Tamanna also mentioned, very, very specific to the local climatic conditions of a place, which then affects a heat wave. That is what makes it so scary, because you don't have a one-size-fits-all solution which could solve the problem of heat for the entire country. You would need the impacts are very different for systems, for different systems as well as for different sectors. Your response measure for a health sector will be very different from what an urban planning would do, or what a labor department would do, right? And if you specifically look at impacts, impacts are not there in the future, they are there right now. Agriculture, for example, 2022 there was a wheat export ban because of early heat waves. There are crop failures, income losses, railways being affected, power grids, electricity grids being affected. There's a health system being affected, shortage of water. There's so many things happening. So heat is just not a problem when you look at it from a system level or just as a disaster level. I think as personal as heat is, it is something which affects everyone, and therefore I think everyone needs to think about it, not just it being a public health or a public policy concern. I think heat goes much more beyond that, because now we are looking at things like individual adaptive capacities and how each and every individual would then respond to heat. And because there is this huge disparity in how people are able to cope with heat and react to heat and respond to it, I think it's only going to get worse. So the important thing is we need to act now.
Can I just add why it's a policy concern for India? Now, when you truly think about it, India has been hot for the longest time. It's placed in a place on earth at a region where it gets hot, it gets humid. Then why do we truly need to care about it now? I think that's where India's positioning as a developing world comes in. So heat wave impacts more if you don't have resources to adapt to it, and which is extremely true for India. When you look at it, our economy is dependent on people working in the informal sectors, and 75% of our labor force is actually exposed to heat during their work. Now, this means that heat is going to not just impact their livelihoods at work, but also these are the same people who don't have resources back home to adapt to it. They live in tin sheds, they don't have the adequate cooling equipment to deal with heat wave. So not just a direct public health impact, but also just the economy-wide impact. There are many figures floating around about how heat will impact the GDP of the nation in the coming few years. Just to quote a few, the World Bank report says that 2% of India's GDP will be lost by 2050, and this is not just for heat, but also all the climate-related impacts. And if you look at labor exposure to heat, it's by 2030, ILO says 4.8% of working hours are going to be lost, which can truly be a big picture scenario, because this can lead to almost 340 million jobs, equivalent of 340 million jobs being lost by 2030. Now, when you think about that, and when you think about the vulnerable population in India, it's a public policy concern, because this cannot be adapted to at an individual level, which is why it is such a big concern for India, not just today, but also looking at how it's going to progress in the future. With increasing climate, now think about cities as being sponges for heat. Our cities are now absorbing heat at such a fast rate, and climate change only adds up to it. Um, and when this increasing heat happens, it's going to impact all the system scales, as Kandita said. And that's where we need a policy that looks at heat in a long-term manner, and especially for India, not just to save lives today, but in the future.
Thank you so much, Tamanna and Skandita. And I think it makes a lot more sense to put heat waves not only as a health risk, but also to understand that it's going to affect the GDP, it's also going to affect so many other related aspects. But before we dive into the core of your research, could we also bring some nuance with respect to who would be most affected by heat waves or extreme heat? I'm very sure that it's an open secret that it would be the our labor force would be, of course, form a major part of the people who will be at the receiving end. But from a policy perspective and also from an individual perspective, who would be the most vulnerable group that we are looking at, and what would it entail to cater policies around them?
So I think when you think about vulnerability, you also have to think about, in very basic terms, how do humans cope with heat? And how does heat affect them very differently? When you think about that, there are multiple aspects to it. So think about where you're living. That's the first thing. So the built environment around you. There's literature on how urban heat islands, which is basically the more cement you have, the more concrete structures you have in the city, are basically going to trap the heat, and then they're going to release it during the night. So not only do you have hotter days, but you also have hotter nights. So the built environment is one aspect of how much extreme heat is going to impact you. The second thing, where on the basis of how heat impacts you, is the sort of social security and infrastructural security nets you have to deal with it. Now, the social security nets are very simple. A very crude example can be given from a heat wave that occurred in Italy, where most of the people who died due to the heat wave were old people living alone in their homes because they had no one to care for them. This looks very different for India, because India, you can talk about caste segregation, you can talk about where your what sort of occupation, as we talked about labor so much, what sort of occupation are you involved in? And then the other thing is, if you're looking at health system, do you have enough money, or do you have enough access to health systems to actually go to these hospitals, get medications when you actually fall sick due to heat? The other thing is, other social security nets are basically, can you work in the heat, or can you afford to not work when it's too hot outside? So this is where the multifold exposure to heat for laborers come in, right? Not are you being impacted at home, but you're also being impacted at work. You see it, we are currently in Delhi, and God forbid we had to go outside during the afternoon. I'm sure we would find places, marketplaces, street vending zones, which are completely empty. There is no consumer to buy any of the goods that street vendors are selling. So not only are their livelihoods getting impacted, but that also leads to how much money they have to afford to adapt to it. And then the bigger question comes around: can you cool down your body? So for example, if you have hotter nights, you really need some sort of active cooling mechanism, or your house has to be built in a way that that is ventilated enough for the hot air to go out. Most of the sections sections in India, for example, India, you only see 8% of households have ACs and coolers, which is a very small number. And with the increasing heat, your tolerance levels are not going to be increasing as much. So you'll need to be a lot of people will now start banking on these active cooling mechanisms. But do people have that? The next stage is more psychological, it's not psychological, what is the word? Physiological. So your age, if you're an older person, you can't cool down your body that fast. If you're a pregnant woman, your risks for heat exposure goes up way much. If you're a young person, or a kid below 5, then you're more susceptible to getting heat illness or heat stroke. So these are some of the physiological factors that get into the vulnerability towards heat. And then is another then is another feature about the nature of heat itself. In a dry heat with a lot more wind speed, it's easier for your body to cool down because you can sweat it out. During a humid heat day, you're not sweating out any of the excess heat in your body, and hence your body goes to that intolerable level of, or what people call as survivability limit for heat. So these are all the factors that come into play to make someone vulnerable to heat. But if I was to answer your question in one liner, it is sadly the people who have not contributed that much to heat itself. These are people whose carbon emission is as low as it can be, and these are the people who will bear the most of the brunt of heat, and that's where the true role of the state comes in. Skandita, would you like to?
Yeah, I think it's not just so yes, rightly mentioned by Tamanna, the various ways in which you can look at vulnerability. But I think there was also a recent study which talked about how vulnerability then leads to vicious cycles in terms of intrastate and interstate inequalities. So think about it. Someone who is not having an access to, so think about a structure where there is no response from the state for someone to protect themselves from impacts of heat, then that particular person who's already earning so little is then forced to take money out of that income to put that into cooling mechanisms. For example, you would want to install an AC in your house, or maybe it's higher electricity bills, etc. At the end of the day, it is a greater share of out of pocket expenditure which comes in from your pocket and which you are using, which is indirectly then reinforcing poverty, right? So it's like a vicious cycle. You are constantly stuck in it, and it is because those who are the most vulnerable to heat, they have contributed so little to it, and so many of those people exist in our country and also around the world. But most importantly, because in our country, I think it's important then that the state takes the responsibility for taking care of these people and providing some sort of relief, whether it be in forms of subsidies, whether it be in forms of some alternate measures, etc. So in that case, I think that is also one of the reasons why largely our work also looks at governance angles of things, on how state responses, on what measures and policies should we take, how we should better adapt to make sure that those who are the most vulnerable to the impacts of the heat, their suffering is, I think, reduced significantly, if not completely eliminated.
No, I think your answers add so much more nuance in understanding that heat waves, in fact, could not be answered with like a one size fits all policy, because once you bring in so many gradients to look at, of course, you require a localized solution. You need to first have the localized understanding of the problem, and then maybe cater to the localized solution with which we could get the intended result. But as you put it, the problem equally becomes that big, because localized mapping, localized solutions would also require a lot of synergies, which we can come to later. Thank you so much for putting in context heat waves, what the problem is, what we are looking at, and how it can affect. Uh, I think it's the right time to move into the research, one of its kind research, which Sustainable Futures Collaborative did recently and has been very instrumental in also accelerating the kind of conversation that we want when talking about problem like heat waves, which we are experiencing even right now. So, could any one of you put context to the study that SFC recently did, which was about, is India ready for a warming world? Would any one of you want to explain its scope, or maybe identify the reason behind the study and how did you proceed with it? Yeah.
Yeah, I think I can take that up. So I think because heat waves are intensifying in nature and they're impacting so many people, I think the window for us to act is relatively very small. And I think if we need to build on measures which protect our cities as well as our future generations from the devastating impacts of heat, I think the time for that is now. And I think because of that, it is very important to look at how policy behaves and what policy instruments, in this case, we have the heat action plans. How are they acting on ground? Are they actually leading to some action? What are the barriers in the process, etc.? So, in our research, we took a very future facing approach. We collaborated with climate modelers from Harvard and Berkeley to picture how each point in India would look like in a 1.5-degree world, and how much increase in the number of extreme heat wave days would occur in that scenario, which basically means that if today you were having 5 heat wave days, going forward 5 years, 10 years from now, you would maybe have 15, 20, 30 of those. So we tried to map it out, what would that increase look like in the scenario of a 1.5-degree world. We looked at humid heat days since they are more threatening, and we then picked 9 cities who had a population of more than 1 million according to the 2011 census, which covered about 11% of India's urban population, which is just so many people and so many livelihoods which are being impacted. We looked at that to then find out, go to those cities and understand how heat resilience measures are being taking place and what is basically happening on ground, right? So are they moving towards long term resilience and increasing of adaptive capacities of those cities, because it's very important for cities to look at long term action here, because short term actions are just so isolated and limited to a particular season. It's not just a question about I think whether India is ready for what lies, but I think it's also important to think about all the hard-earned economic progress in the recent years, while also ensuring that those who are the most vulnerable people in our country, they are protected. So I think our research therefore fills this very, very critical gap, because it is the first ever multi-city analysis to look at how Indian cities are responding to extreme heat.
Would you want to add anything, Tamanna?
Um, I think a precursor on why this is so important at this juncture, apart from the very urgency that is baked into heat and climate, is the fact that the heat conversation, the heat policy conversation, just to give a precursor to listeners, it's based on the heat action plans, the only policy instrument there in India to deal with it. On paper, it's a very simple plan. It basically tells all the departments what to do during, before, and after a heat wave. Now these are actions, short-term action. These are short-term actions like having ORS capacity, giving water to the people, or having some temporary cooling centers, for example. But they also have some baked in long-term solutions, such as how do you envision your built environment so that it doesn't trap heat? How do you look at long-term health system preparedness so that it can cope with the increasing number of admissions that are going to come in due to the heat impacts? While on paper it's simple, but you think about it, these are things that are going to be done by multiple different departments and during multiple times of the year. With climate change, the frequency of heat waves are increasing. So think about a month where you have, say, three major heat waves going over, say, 4 or 5 days. That's almost major part of your month already, and that's how June, July looks like right now in India. And all of these departments will have to come to the same table and look at how much resources they have within their departments and figure out how to implement these solutions written in the heat action plan. And we've been thinking about, and there's so many conversations about heat action plan. Different civil society organizations in India are working on creating heat action plans with the local government, but do they really know if it works on ground? And that's why the very important factor that we went on ground and talked to implementers about what they're doing for heat. Is heat action plan the instrument that's actually pushing action, or is it happening in a different formula or different platform altogether? So these are some of the burning questions we had in our mind when we went to do the study. And very happy to talk about what we found next.
And if my memory serves me right, as a part of this exercise, you interviewed 88 officials, including disaster management officials, health officials, labor departments, district administrator, and city administrators as well. Would you want to take some time and maybe highlight the broader findings, something that stood out in this exercise?
Yeah. Um, so, just to sort of paint the picture that we went to these 9 cities, it was a group of 2 researchers going to 9 cities within a span of 4 to 5 months. That was an expansive and painstaking journey. We had to wait outside every department's offices for multiple hours, waiting for an interview that could give you so much. Some of these departments would be really looking forward to talking to us. Some of the departments not so much. And the things we found from the conversation was that I think it painted a picture for us about how heat is actually dealt with. If you think about the broader findings from the study, I'll get into the nitty gritty later on. But heat in itself, when you think about it, it's such an invisible issue, right? You don't have impacts such as a cyclone taking away your house, a cyclone destroying all the infrastructure, destroying all the crops. But heat comes over a certain amount of time, has long standing impacts on health, and is rather invisible to a bureaucrat who has 1,000 things on the plate already. Something almost similar to how climate change is looked at when it comes to bureaucracy. Most of the climate issues, it's looked at something that happens in the background but isn't really the core policy issue that people work towards. Now, when we went to these departments, we asked them questions, varying different questions about what are the sort of actions they're taking for heat waves, the short-term actions that were being taken up by multiple of the cities. So we found that almost all the cities were trying to take actions of setting up cooling centers, rather temporary cooling centers. So what a temporary cooling center is, basically you would have a mall, you would repurpose it for people to go and to take shade during the afternoon. You would have things like awareness campaigns around the government telling people to stay indoors during heat, to wear light colored clothes, to hydrate themselves during heat. These are some of the things that were happening all across, including ORS availability in the hospitals, allocating certain beds for heat stroke patients and stuff like that. Now, that sort of paints a successful picture. Now, this is with the caveat that we did not test the on ground implementation of all of these things individually. This is coming straight from the horse's mouth. The implementers are telling this is something that is there on the table that they're implementing. But that also paints a successful picture in terms of the fact that heat is now at least a policy issue. So heat wave is something that they get directive towards, they have some things to do towards, which is a successful picture because the first heat action plan only came out 10 years, almost a decade ago, which was the Ahmedabad 2013 heat action plan. But when it comes to the long term is where the picture gets really grainy. Long term was scattershot across these cities. Some of the long term actions, now short term actions are basically actions you have to take season by season. It will not have a long term effect on the adaptive capacity of the society. It's not building towards resilience. For example, very easy example to do is if you have heat stroke rooms in your hospital, sure, it's a very important issue because this is where the cooling equipments would be, and you have to rapidly cool down the body of someone who's suffering from heat illness for it to actually have an effect. But does it have a long-term effect on the number of people actually coming into the hospital because of the heat illness? Not really. But when you look at the long term, basically building the health system capacity, these are some of the things that will have, for example, you train your hospital workers to recognize what a heat illness looks like and how do you treat it. Some of these things are happening in few of the cities. For example, health staff training was happening across 8 cities. So was recording heat deaths. Now, heat death, I could talk about recording of heat deaths for maybe 5 or 10 minutes, but I'll keep it short. But the bare basic minimum is that it's very hard for a death to be ascribed to heat. Most of these deaths they come up as heart attacks or other sort of illnesses and not being ascribed to heat. So you don't really know how many people are dying due to heat. And many factors go into it. There's a really short period of time where you can actually see if the internal body temperature is to a certain threshold that for you to say they've died because of heat. Plus, do doctors really know how to do that? Plus, do you have enough monitoring mechanisms for this to be then nationalized as a data form that can inform policies? So these are some of the things that are happening, but most of the long term was focused on the health system. While important, this also means that the other sectors which will lead to more heat impacts. For example, if you're looking at the built environment, if your built environment is still cemented, overtly concrete, does not have enough green space, the hospitals, no matter how prepared they are for the heat patients, they are going to be they're not going to be able to cope up with the amount of people coming in the future. So that is something for the long term that we looked at. Skandita, do you want to take a crack at long-term incidental?
Yeah, so when we talk about long-term actions, I think in our report we kind of described them as two, divided them into two. First were long-term intentional actions, and second were long-term incidental actions. Long-term intentional, I would go first. Intentional would be anything where you are specifically targeting it for a very long-term state response towards heat. So, for example, as Tamanna mentioned, you train your medical and healthcare system to prepare for heat because they are the front line when it comes to dealing with those medical cases. That's a very long-term preparatory measure specifically targeted for heat. But what also became very interesting was in a number of interactions with bureaucrats, every time you would ask them, what is it that you're doing for heat? They would list down a lot of short-term measures and then list down measures such as, oh, we plant trees, and oh, we do rainwater harvesting, and solar rooftop and things like that, which directly do not have any impact on heat. Often there were instances where they could not draw a link between planting trees and maybe how it was helping with heat, because they would, so when we would ask where are you planting the trees, they would say we are planting them in the parks where there are already so many trees. So I think just this bureaucratic understanding, which is also I think one of the barriers which we identified in terms of weak technical capacity, where a bureaucrat understanding that you would want to map, let's say, a UHI, or understand, which is an urban heat island effect, or understand what are the areas which actually have higher temperatures in a given city, and then you specifically plant trees there. Things like those I think are very crucial. So when there's this sort of a mismatch which happens, those are actions which we basically term as long-term incidental. So you are not able to link it to how it would help a city prepare for heat, but you're just doing it because maybe there's some other scheme which is asking you to do it, or you're just doing it also because I think in cities which did not have a heat action plan, and they were still implementing a lot of things related to heat. When we asked them questions around what is it that you are doing for heat, they listed out a lot of these incidental measures because they didn't really have an intention or a backing by a heat action plan to implement those actions.
Now that we know that where the situation is and what the findings are and how eloquently you both have painted a picture that what are the losses that we will suffer with heat waves and with increasing temperatures, what do you think were the barriers? Because one would imagine that it's like something that needs to be dealt with immediately, but I realize that same with the climate change, it's a silent killer, right? We don't know when is it happening and whom is it affecting. But otherwise, from your conversations, what were the barriers which you identified were like very glaring and could be like very low hanging fruits which we could target and work on?
I think there are many different things, right? Just from our interviews, we found that coordination was the one thing. Coordination between departments and across departments that was hampering heat action to be done in a way that could benefit the vulnerable and build long term resilience. Why coordination is important, I think I already touched upon, but because this will require multiple departments to sit at the same table, and if they're not sitting at the same table and not coordinating well, this is not going to happen in a way that will build long-term resilience. There's a lot of scope for maladaptation here. Now, maladaptation is something where, for example, your incidental thing, the urban planning department, when they're sort of thinking about how to build a city, they go for concrete because that is something that appeases to people now. That's not something that's baked within the heat resilience thing. Now that concrete might be good for their own sectoral perspective, but that's not something that you do for heat waves. Coordination also meant that a lot of these departments, when we went to them, we found that of the 25 departments we asked this question, I think 16 of them did not have the heat action plans. And they were listed within the heat action plan with things they had to do. So that's an extremely different case where even though they're doing stuff, they don't really know how to do it well because they don't even have the heat action plan to begin with. In some of the areas, it was basically during a heat wave, we have a nodal department. Like all things in the bureaucracy goes, there will be someone who is spearheading a particular cause. So a nodal department during heat wave can vary from place to place. In some places, it is the disaster management department. In some places, it is the health department because again, heat wave is such a health issue. Now these departments found it very difficult to call on other departments to come to their meetings, especially when it comes to the health department. We saw in a particular city in North India that the health department, even though this is happening in a city that has dealt with heat far better than other cities, but the nodal department can't call upon the other departments to the same table. And the health system here, the health department in that city had so much more expertise because they were collaborating with other civil society organizations, were thinking about urban planners as well. But if the urban planning authority is not coming to your meetings, how do you tell them what to do? This was the one big thing that came across all our interviews. 26% of our respondents says we can't coordinate well. The other thing that came up was, I think, because of heat as the policy issue that's treated right now. So when it comes to, we did an analysis of 37 heat action plans back in 2023, and we found that none of these heat action plans had a legal basis. So when I say there's no legal basis, basically these are not housed in a law which will make the implementers implement these actions. And when you have something like a plan without any legal basis, it can sit on an implementer's table, never to be implemented, or you can't hold them accountable for it. And because of that nature of heat policy in India, there were many departments which did not find the need to implement it. Now, there was also another thing where heat is not seen as a policy issue because they have 1,000 other things to deal with. When it comes to the disaster management, I think something that truly calls to me is when you're talking to a disaster management official in a North Indian city, we found that we asked them, what are you doing for heat? And we went during the monsoon season. I think the monsoon season was just starting. And I remember I don't want to quote them because this might not be the exact quote, but they said something on the lines of heat is now in the past because we are now dealing with the monsoons. The roads are now going to very soon clog up. There's going to be urban flooding. Who is ever going to think about heat now? And that is the time period when you see what happened during the heat wave that was just passed. What do we learn from our mistakes? And when you're not thinking about these things in a more all around the year fashion, you're going to end up doing just the short term. The other thing, not a barrier but rather a problem, is the long-term imagination within these bureaucrats. This also came from the fact that we had a very interesting bunch of cities in our sample. So we went to a place we went to very small cities and very big cities. We went to Delhi, Bangalore, Bombay, and then we went to smaller cities like Kota, Ludhiana, and some of these places might not be seeing heat as much now, even though they are, but not in an extent where what the climate modeling has told us, and the implementers are not aware of that fact. So they're not aware of how the future looks like for the city they're inhabiting, and that sort of boils down the fact that makes for the fact that when you don't have a long-term imagination of what the future looks like, how do you plan for it? I think within a sample of 88 implementers we talked to, probably three or two who had climate projections about how the city would look like in the future. The rest of them did not. So many people have told us that heat is not an issue here. Go to X city in this state. They are the ones facing the most extreme heat. But our entire climate modeling and sampling was based on the fact that these are the cities which are going to see the most extreme increase in heat wave days from where they are right now. So we didn't go to cities which were the hottest or which were going to be the hottest. We went to cities which would see that change come in within a very short span of time. And this short time span would mean that they have so less time to implement this stuff, but also there's not enough time to get acquainted with the climate science behind it. So the sort of actions that need to come from the top in terms of the data there is, which is another challenge in itself, is going to be massive, and it has to be done now, while maintaining that action happens at the local level. Skandar, do you want to add?
Yeah, I think Tamanna rightly mentioned a lot of these institutional constraints. I think there are a few other things also. For example, the way the current policy system operates, it's very reactionary in nature. For example, 2023 Kharghar, there was this massive event which was organized in an open field in Kharghar in Navi Mumbai, where about 13 people died from a heat stroke. And it was only after that incident that a weather station got installed in Kharghar. Before that, the closest weather station there was, which could accurately predict, was more than 30 kilometers away. With weather changing every 6 kilometers, it could not really predict that that area would have a heat wave. And then it did. And then there was this reactionary measure. So a lot of these actions which are currently happening are very reactionary top-down guidelines, which basically means that you have a very hyper-local problem, but you have a top guideline coming from the top which tries to solve for everything and everyone, which basically does not fix the problem. And also I think from a very local perspective, it gives very little to the implementers, because it's like they are being spoon-fed after a point. They have everything. For example, if it's an IEC material, which is like an educational awareness material which is coming in, they are provided with the materials, they are provided with the exact funds that might be needed. Sometimes they are given the material in itself, all they need to do is just print and put it. So the amount of incentive which is left for a local implementing bureaucrat to add in their own flavor to it and make it more hyper specific to the ground level is so low, which also I think acts as a major barrier. And I think secondly, when we look at disasters or any disaster in general, I think a big angle for disasters, during disasters, is how people respond to disasters, like general public. If it's an earthquake, if it's a flood, etc., there are people who move out, who go out for relief, not only in the case of a death, but most importantly just in case of general relief, providing them measures, providing them with basic amenities, etc. That's not there for heat, because I think India has historically been a hotter country. Heat is still a very personal issue, a matter of I think individual resilience, where you deal with it yourself eventually. It's you who feels hot, and that could also differ from person to person depending on so many factors, whether you're hydrated or not, etc. So this sort of lack of public demand specific to heat, because it's also a question, right? What is it that you demand from the state during heat? Like, there's no one answer to it. There could be so many things. What we found on ground were very immediate relief measures. For example, work breaks, demands for water or electricity to various line departments, etc. Or in case of a heat death or a major event, media acting as a channel to provide those sort of the link between the two, or maybe institutions who are filling those gaps. But these small nuances, I think, also help us shape and understand how heat action and heat governance in India takes place, because the policy structure is kind of focused on short term. You have institutional barriers, and then it's not like people are really coming out and protesting for heat. Like, how would you? It is so hot already outside. You would rather want to sit inside in the shade, right? So there are all of these. It's very interesting, but I think it's also confusing at the same time for someone to understand how complicated it is. So yeah.
And I think from your answers, it reminds me a quote that I found in the research, wherein one of the officers had admitted that we are lurching from crisis to crisis. and we don't have enough time to think about these things. And I think it aptly summarizes a lot of these findings that you've just shared, which, I mean, of course, coordination and all of these things happen to dominate, but also this bigger challenge with respect to the capacity of the state as such to also deal with it, and then seriousness is obviously again a big challenge. With all of the context that we have and the barriers that you just mentioned, would you want to highlight something that stood out for you? I mean, something with which you were inspired, with which that is happening, and something that you think truly holds potential? I mean, we will come to prospective solutions that you think work, but right now, something that you see, that you saw that actually worked and is giving results?
Yeah, I think so. We had this. We have so. I think what we have described these individuals or institutions are as champions, bureaucratic champions or institutional champions who are actually going above and beyond to implement heat measures where others might not, right? For example, I think one of our favorite success stories is of this bureaucratic champion from Ludhiana, who repurposed, who basically went around the city to track for UHI, which is Urban Heat Island. She went around, I think, contacted a local remote sensing institution around there to get it mapped. Had targeted tree plantation, realized that those smaller saplings needed protection, had those sheds, I think, installed around those small guards installed around those trees, like small measures, but just going above and beyond. Understanding that it's a threat, understanding that these are issues which need to be dealt with, and then also involving the community, involving local institutions, making people feel responsible for their city. I think those small things really stand out because at the end of the day, it has to be a bottom up, people-led approach rather than a top-down state-led approach. Yeah. Dikta Manna, what do you want to add?
I think this comes back to your question, which I think, forgot to answer, the low hanging fruits, right? So, when you look at the sort of long term action, short term action, sure, people are doing, you keep implementing them, the more they're implementing, the better. But what's truly needed is the long term. How do you protect your infrastructure, your lives, your livelihoods in the next 10 years? That's why a low hanging fruit is to basically look at these actions that are happening already. So existing schemes take care of a lot of heat solutions, as you rightly said, co-benefit approach, right? So you're looking at tree plantations, you're looking at rainwater harvesting, you're looking at water bodies rejuvenation, you're looking at urban planning, making for open spaces, you're looking at parks, but what's truly needed is to target it to the most vulnerable. This is something that needs to be done, and you already have resources to do that. So, for example, we did a study last year, I think, where basically looked at the centrally sponsored schemes in India. We looked at 72 of these schemes. So these are basically schemes that are conceptualized at the national level, but implemented at the local level. So the local implementer has some sort of say in some sort of some small tweaks that they can make to the implementation of the schemes. And these are schemes that make almost made up for 10% of the union budget. So there's a lot of money there, and that solves for one of the biggest problem in the heat policy in India, which is basically that all the heat action plans floating around barely have any financing behind them. So you can list out 20 solutions, but if you have no money to implement it, how are they going to get implemented? That's where you sort of back on these existing schemes. And we found that out of the 72 schemes, 18 had direct linkages to heat solutions listed in the HAPs. And these are some of the solutions like plantation. You can have Nagar Van Yojana, which leads to urban greening. You can have Campa funds. You can have smart city mission that is looking at various of these things. You have Jal Jeevan mission to have tap water connection. Water, such an important part of the adaptive capacity to be built for heat. And it's now up to the local implementer. So this is the district magistrate, for example, in a district, as Skandita said, the very nice lady who works as the DC for Ludhiana. She thought of some things that she could do with the plantation. Now all you basically need are some data points. For example, a urban heat island which tells you that these are the areas. So if a city has 10 wards, for example, it tells you that two of these wards house 80% of your most heat vulnerable population. If you target your schemes to these areas, and these areas could be vulnerable because of many different things, the more cements, less green space, and when you target all those schemes to these, you'll get the most out of it, almost like getting the most out of your most bang for your buck, right? So when you truly target the existing schemes, it's in the policy realm, it's basically called mainstreaming heat resilience within the existing schemes. That is the lowest hanging fruit, and something that a heat action plan can potentially play a role in, because a heat action plan, ideally, a very good heat action plan would have a few things. So one of the things is a vulnerability assessment, which tells you who are the most vulnerable, where do they live in your city. So things like that, and when you then add on to the existing schemes, that is the lowest hanging fruit. But apart from that, I think one of the major success stories we've seen, not just one but across India, across the 9 cities, wherever more civil society organizations were involved with the government department, hand holding them for a few things, that's where a lot of success stories came out of. Something uh, that should be talked about is how do you make heat visible in the eyes of the bureaucrat. And I think that's where civil society organizations, apart from of course the technical angle they bring in to the heat conversation, that's the role they can play. For example, in one of the cities, the civil society organization started the heat conversation. There was no heat conversation in the city we went to, but the civil society organization came up with the heat map, gave it to the bureaucrats, showed them how bad the city actually looks. The entire urban heat island map was red. Red basically means most of the hottest places in the cities. And the bureaucrat looked at it and said, "Oh, that's that is bad, and we have to work for it." So you have to sort of make heat visible to these bureaucrats, and it can be done through various different things. When you're looking at the existing scheme, it also means that they have incentive to implement some of these actions because they're already doing that. And couple that with a civil society organization telling them how to do it well, I think that will lead to most of the heat incidental stuff that we talk about to go into the heat intentional bracket, and just adding on to the resilience of the city as a whole.
But as Skandada mentioned in the Khargar's example, that once the deaths took place, it really gave an impetus to the stakeholders there so as to implement certain measures. If, for example, if it's not these stakeholders, like the example that you just talked about, are there any other thing which you might want to highlight, basically, which could really drive this sensitivity or action towards increasing our understanding and also to bring people more on the table, or which you saw in your experience, which is really working beyond CSOs taking an active stand?
I think from a very individual perspective, I think we should start changing the way we look at heat. It's not just summer season anymore, it's not just the hot season anymore. It might just be your reality throughout the year in the next maybe 5 6 years, right? That you barely have spring anymore. It might just be that it's all just summer throughout, and there's no conventional understanding of summers or hot season, which basically means is that people in general need to look at heat irrespective of whether you're a bureaucrat or a normal civilian. We should look at heat from the perspective of the danger which it gets, and not really the visible wreckage it may or may not leave behind it all the times. Like, why is it that do we have to wait for lives to be lost for us to take heat seriously? I think it sort of triggers me a bit every time someone says heat is such an invisible threat or a silent killer, because what you're basically then doing is that you are blanketing it under okay, it's normal and it's okay, till the time there are some lives lost or some major incident happens somewhere, and then suddenly the entire state machinery panics, and then there's an immediate reaction to it which will not even last the next season. So I think this general perception of us looking at, oh, heat is not a threat, we have always dealt with it, or maybe just adopting to small measures like, okay, nimu pani or stuff will save us from heat. I think we need to move beyond that to understand that it's a much bigger, graver threat. And just this difference in perception, I think, is something which can help make it much more visible, not only to people but also to the bureaucracy. I think more importantly, people should also demand things from the state. I think that comes in once you understand the nature of the threat, and then you pose questions which are then worth answering. Because unless you don't understand it yourself, it becomes very difficult for you to ask those questions from the state and demand some sense of accountability. I think so. That's from my side, that there is a graver need for a change in larger perception around heat.
That's another sociological, so to say, discussion, because yesterday itself I was told by someone that iska to kya kar sakte hain. So, I think that's the place where sociology needs to marry science and to be able to come with something that's, like a bigger understanding as to why we don't respond to things that are right in front of us as well. I don't have the answer. Moving beyond, setting the context of where we are, the barriers and solutions that are working, what are the kind of recommendations that you were able to make, seeing the context that you have, which really have the ability to solve the crisis that we are in right now? There are a lot of short-term solutions. Maybe you want to highlight some of the tectonic changes that we really need to look at, the conversations that we need to have. Really appreciate that. And before that, if any one of you could also want to take a minute or two and also highlight what actually a heat action plan is. I think it's justified for everyone to know, because we have talked so much about heat action plans, and then jump into the other question.
Yeah, let me take the heat action plan question. So heat action plan are basically guidance documents made at different levels of the government. So you can have a state heat action plan, you can have a district heat action plan, and you can have a city heat action plan. It has a few components towards it. When you look at it on paper, it starts with trying to understand the type of heat that the particular place has experienced before. So for example, how did your last 10 years look like? Now, let me take a very on-ground example. For Delhi, we'll look at what the last 10 years look like in terms of what the maximum temperatures were, what were the minimum temperatures, and ideally, in a very ideal world, we'll look at are the nighttime temperatures increasing. And this is important because this will lead to you making a heat wave threshold. So basically, if I can go back to the Kharghar incident, the Kharghar incident was never really, a heat wave wasn't declared when the Kharghar incident happened, because the nearest station was so far away, and that recorded a temperature lower than the heat wave threshold. So whatever actions that are activated when a heat wave is declared could not happen there. And I think at the core of it is that it is so important to set a very localized threshold. So you'll have a baked, you'll have an understanding of how the historical temperatures look like, what would be the relative humidity baked into it, and then you look at, maybe in a very ideal world, how will it go in the future. And when you set a very localized temperature threshold, that means the government with very scarce resources, even though a lot more resources to be mainstream, but still scarce enough that if you set the temperature 1 or 2 degrees lower or higher, you can either spark panic by declaring a heat wave at a lower temperature, wasting government resources, or not declare a heat wave and lead to something like a Kharghar incident. The second step is then the sort of actions that you take, and that is now baked on a vulnerability assessment. So the heat action plan usually tells the local departments, for example, if you're doing a Delhi heat action plan, you'll look at all the districts and see which are the districts, or if it's a very granular plan, granular plan, then it'll look at what are the wards that will experience the most heat, or are experiencing the most heat. Now this can be based on various different terminologies and methodologies. A very shortcut way of doing it is have a UHI map, a urban heat island map, which tells you these are the areas which are the hottest. A more nuanced way of looking at it is the sort of people who are living there. For example, if you have a certain section of this a ward which has a lot of slum areas, that's definitely where the state should intervene, rather than, for example, in Delhi, some place like Chanakyapuri. Okay, Chanakyapuri might not be central Delhi, where basically all the embassies are. That's not where action needs to happen, and the action needs to happen where people who truly need it are being housed. So these are some of the metrics that go into the vulnerability assessment. Now that you've figured out where the vulnerable population is and when you need to take the action, then you get into what are the action that needs to be taken by different level of departments. Now the water department can be looking at providing water, and it could be looking at long term ensuring water supply for more and more people, so have every household has a tap connection or not. For the disaster management departments, it's usually a coordinating role where they bring on the table all the departments. For the health department, it's short term of ORS, having hospital beds, long term that you're maintaining records of heat deaths, that can then feed into the localized threshold to tell you this is the temperature where the heat deaths will start going up. So it's a policy feedback loop, right? So some of these actions are then then listed out in the heat action plans. The last but truly the most important thing is how do you implement them, and that's where the institutional basis for the heat action plan comes in. So you'll have things like departments meet for this many times a year. These are some of the things you do before, these are some of the things you do after. Then you take into account you need money to implement this plan, so you flesh out again in a very ideal heat action plan something that doesn't really exist. You will say this is the money you're allocating to do this action, and then you'll have some sort of accountability baked into it so that the implementers actually implement the actions. Then you'll have some sort of learning from our experience part of the section, which would be monitoring and evaluating the sort of actions that have taken, what sort of impacts they've had on the ground, and do you need to tweak them or change them for the future. So this is what a heat action plan on paper looks like. Yeah, I forgot your second question.
The second question was about like the measures that should be taken, or the whole promise to be able to deal with this crisis. Yeah.
So now that we have a precursor, rather long precursor on what a heat action plan is, we recommend a few things that could lead to a more resilient India, heat resilient India. The first thing is these heat action plans strengthen them. So at current, these heat action plans don't have a legal basis. Only when we reviewed the 37 heat action plans back in 2023, only 2 of them had appropriate financial mechanisms listed out to implement some of these actions. Most of them did not take into account stakeholder consultations with the people who are actually implementing, who are actually impacted by the heat. So for example, it's only the departments who are coming up with this heat action plan, and in many of the cases only one department making a heat action plan in 2 days. The impacted population is not brought to the table, their demands are not being taken care of. So in a sense, these heat action plans are not at all suited to the local context of the area. They also don't have localized temperature thresholds. So most of these heat action plans use thresholds that are set by the IMD at the national level, and this does not take into account how heat is truly felt at a very local area. So if you truly have to have a heat action plan that's implementable, you have to strengthen it from different angles. Either you have a law that you can put the heat action plan in, a state can come up with a law. A very shortcut mechanism to get most of the short-term actions within the heat action plan implemented is for a state to declare heat wave as a local disaster. That can sort of bake into the machinery some accountability, but it also opens up few funds for compensation to be given to heat-related deaths and stuff. A broader conversation that's now happening at the national scale is the National Disaster Mitigation Fund. This might be a bit technical, but last year there was an amendment made to the law of the National Disaster Mitigation Fund, which is basically a fund you use to implement a lot of long-term solutions for different disasters. Heat wave wasn't declared, wasn't notified as a disaster you could use the money for, but that changed last year. So now states can actually give proposals to the NDMF and their the state counterpart, which is the State Disaster Mitigation Fund, and give a proposal of the sort of solution, long-term solution that you want to implement, and get money from that. Now that is an avenue that has opened up. I'm not sure how many states actually know that this is something that has opened up. The other thing in sort of financing is, again, use existing funds in a way that's more useful to the vulnerable sections of the society, but also think about bringing in private players on board. The private sector is where a lot of experimentation and thinking around new ideas happen. For example, one of our recommendations is also that a lot of the long-term solutions that are happening now, they miss out on a big chunk of long-term solution. For example, none of the cities were thinking about how to increase access to cooling for the most heat exposed and vulnerable households. They were not thinking about how to build a future grid that can withstand heat and the sort of demand that will go up because of the new cooling appliances that are being added to the economy. They were not thinking about sort of getting granular data for temperature to add to the localized threshold. So these were things that were not being thought about. How do you think about this is that you train these implementers to think about heat in a more prioritized way. The other thing is, the other thing I would say is thinking about giving climate projections to these implementers. Now, this is a really tricky territory because an implementer, for example, a water department in a city like Kota, cannot or will not be able to understand climate projections as they were given to us for the study. You have to really translate the climate projections in a way that tells these city implementers how the city will be impacted, how their sector will be impacted, and what you can do about it. So there are few things that can be thought about. And again, the main agenda here is to have more long-term solutions that can be well financed and well implemented. Even if a city is implementing two of these long-term solutions, it's better than not than rather scattershot implementation of five of these.
Skandita, would you want to take a stab at anything
Yeah, I
which
think because we talked about finance, I think what is also important for us to understand here is that in our study we found out that a lot of people a lot of bureaucrats did not really mention the need for additional finance because the schemes and the short term measures which they were largely implementing, they had the money attached with it already. But going forward, when cities start implementing long term measures, they would be requiring more money. So CSS schemes, for example, repurposing money from them, or other ways, maybe you bring in private capital from some into make in adaptation finance and into heat finance. But we would require much more money than what is currently in flow in the system. So I think that is something very important. And I think in measures like these, it is important that a bureaucrat who is sort of sitting on that chair and who has to take these decisions has enough technical capacity to understand okay, what if I don't get the money, what is the next best alternative that I can use, or I can come up with something innovative of my own. I think those small things come in only when you understand heat, you understand the threat, and you also understand how to deal with it. I think internally we had we used the narrative of you know where to dig the hole with the shovel, right? You know where to plant the trees, you know where to sort of when to do what. Those small measures you understand the nature of the threat, you know what can work, what will not work, where it will not work, who's most vulnerable. This sort of understanding and this larger technical capacity to understand the nature of the problem, find out solutions, see what works, what does not work, how do we cope with it, and what is the best solution going forward depending on that particular context. I think those are things which need to be built in our systems, and our systems need to understand and evolve on the basis of those very hyper, very local solutions, very specific, but moving towards the long-term future.
Can I just add here
Yeah.
quickly? I think one of the boldest recommendations in our report is creating a targeted cooling program for the most vulnerable. Um, just to just to put the entire focus on cooling rather than talking about heat. Let's envision a future, or rather a present. I like to think about in three different brackets, right? You're at home, you're feeling hot if you don't have enough ventilation, or your built environment is bad. Then you're traveling for work, your transport systems need to be cooling enabled, or you have enough shelters, or shelters with active cooling shelters, which are Jodhpur recently had a net zero cooling center with active fans. And then you think about work and how cooling can be enabled there. Now, thinking about that future and the sort of reliance on active cooling, you're going to see a large scale increase in the number of ACs that are going around. And think about the upper middle class or the lower middle. Let's talk about the lower middle class. They can't afford the energy efficient ACs at the current price. As far as I remember, I think a good 5-star AC can cost you 40K. Does a middle class household have that sort of money? Forget about the lower sections of the society. And the sort of cooling needs are going to massively increase in the future. So our recommendation is that when you have to think about the section of the population well below the middle class, you have to think about not just um, uh, sort of building a cooling package for them. So you have low hanging fruit in terms of passive cooling. So passive cooling is something that does not require electricity. So it's basically something as simple as a cool roof. Cool roof is basically painting your roof with a white reflective paint that can reduce your indoor temperatures by 2 or 3 degrees. Um, Research has shown that it can also reduce the number of hours you use the AC, or the number of hours you require the fan. But you need to complement that with sort of giving a subsidy package for these people, this section of the population, to go for the more energy efficient cooling mechanisms. And this is where we also bring in the mitigation point of view, right? The more and more carbon emissions you have, the more the earth will get heated up, and in the end you you can't have the burden fall on the most vulnerable sections, or the most marginalized sections of the population. And the state, maybe with some of the private players, have to step in to give some of the cooling equipments at a subsidized rate for a very clean energy sort of world to these people. I think that is one of the most bold recommendations in our report, and something that will truly require us to think about everything, a systems level thinking almost. Your electricity grid has to be retrofitted to meet up that demand. You have to think about the industry there. What sort of incentives would the industry need to give these active cooling equipments to the people? And then you think about how do you generate that demand within that section of the population? How do you incentivize them to not go for second-hand uh, low energy, or rather poor energy efficient cooling equipments to then this? Almost think about how the LED program went about in India, right? So many efforts had to be put in from so many different angles. Cooling is going to be the next issue that people discuss, and I think we need to do it now.
Thank you so much for that masterclass on heat wave and what needs to be done. Before I ask for a call to action, which would be like one thing that you might want to share with the audience, when I was reading the report and I was going through and as you just said, it was such an expansive exercise lasting over 4 months. I'm just curious if any one of you wants to share any anecdote or any incident that happened during that exercise. which was the highlight for you, that would be great. If not, I would really appreciate it. If not, we could certainly move on to call to action and something that you think the audience must know and should act on.
If I not truly related to the report at hand, but I thoroughly enjoyed my trip to Bombay. That was one of the cities which truly opened my mind to how many things these people have to deal with. Uh, Even in Delhi being such an expansive city, but because it is so decentralized, it has so many districts and so many municipal corporations. Bombay doesn't act that way. Bombay is more centralized. You have the disaster management cell baked in the BBMC, the Bombay Municipal Corporation. You have so many people there. It's such a huge building, and to just talk to one person there would take at least 2 hours of the day. Three of us went to Bombay, and it was a journey in itself. I mean, we went to the Urban Planning Authority. They talked to us about slums. We went to the Slum Development Authority. They talked to us about the Urban Planning Authority. It was rather a blame game that you have to find your way out of, but also just watching the city function within. And we also went during a very hot day, and the city didn't stop for the heat wave. The city stopped for nothing. But still, when you talk to these departments, you see they are thinking about it. But what's really needed is something that has to be packaged in a way that will call to them. I think that's what Bombay is a city that really put into perspective, at least for me, that this is not a game that can happen with a very um, that can happen at a very central level or at the local level. It'll have to be a amalgamation of all stakeholders coming together, thinking about this as something being as people being impacted, and I think also the fact that outside your own comfortable AC rooms, there is a section of the population that are suffering every day. Um, and when you take that look, it really puts into perspective a lot of things for you. And I think just looking at the seaside, everyone flocking to the seaside, even if they're sweating constantly, something that Bombay truly put in perspective for me.
I think for me, it was the first time I actually went out on field to see how the state functions, and I think just like visiting municipal corporation offices and talking to officers in different cities. I think just a very different perspective on how that sense of that side of the state works, how bureaucracy works. I remember we were trying to locate this particular department in this city on Google Maps, and then it did not show us the correct location because it was tagged incorrectly. And then we had to walk in the middle of a highway to actually find that place. So those small things you just take away, and you think about how maybe someone, if a normal person who didn't have access to maybe Google Maps would have to go, it would be such a hard task. But those small things, I think, just in terms of how everyone looks at heat and understand heat so differently. Even within the bureaucracy, you would find all sorts of folks, those who treat heat to be a very serious threat, understand nitty-gritties of it, and then those who would dismiss it, saying it's an act of God. So it's a very complex domain, but I think it's taught me so many lessons about looking beyond the comfort of your room. As Tamanna also mentioned, that there are people out there who are suffering, like you prevent, like consciously choosing not to order from Blinkit or Zomato during those peak hours. Small things, but it just puts everything right into perspective for you, I guess.
Sorry, can I add one thing? I just thought about it while Skandita was speaking about it. I think it was Skandita and I that went to this department, and again, to anonymize the city, we'll say a North Indian city. We went to the district magistrate's office while they were doing Jan Sunbai. This is basically one day in a week where everyone flocks to the district magistrate office to ask them about their needs. And at that point, I felt like, am I Am I now taking the space from these people to talk about these, talk about the research we're doing? Just puts into perspective that when you think about public demand for heat, it's never going to be about heat. That's what made me think about it. Like, there's so many people going around. There was recently in Varanasi, I think, a group of Blinkit workers, drivers. They came up with an ask that they need breaks. They can't do the mandatory afternoon hours. They need some break. They need some water provision. It makes you think about Amazon workers. They never truly protested against heat. What they wanted was break. What they wanted was bare minimum asks of water. And this is how the bureaucracy functions. The bureaucracy will respond to demands like water, demands like electricity. But how do you actually put heat on the table via the public demand route is something I think that keeps boggling my mind and made me think of the Johnson wire, which I really didn't want to get into.
Thank you so much for these examples, and I think these field trips, of course, puts in perspective all the high level talks, the experience that you had on the ground. That's totally different and requires a lot more hard work and sensitivity. So walking on a tightrope, right? So is there any call to action which you might want to share with the audience?
I again I would go back to my earlier framing of looking beyond your AC rooms. So I if the listener of this if the listeners currently are sitting in the AC rooms and during a very hot day, think about your house help, think about offering them water, think about there is a huge uh, we were talking to someone the other day and they said that most of the house helps that they talk to for a particular survey said that the house owner does not let them use the washrooms. They do not offer them water. They don't allow them to use the same facilities. These are small things that you have to think about. And I wouldn't expect the most marginalized of the section to think about the long term, but then the responsibilities lie on us. At some point, we have to think about our carbon emissions. We also have to think about um, just thinking about nature as something you fight for. How do you do that? That's up to you. But these are small things we have to think about. People beyond your comfortable bubble, and what you could do for them at your own individual. Um, I think that is the call for action.
Yeah, I think also just sorry, I lost the trail of my thought. But I think also from a very pure policy perspective, I think people who are sitting on the top need to sort of understand that it's not just a seasonal threat. It is something which is going to last, going to stay, and only increase in the coming years, which basically means that our institutions and our systems need to be better prepared and more strengthened with the sense of danger which is coming in. And I think from a very personal, individual perspective, going back to my earlier framing on how we need to look at heat beyond the summer season, that it's something which will stay. And because of the nature of inequality which lies with heat resilience, on how people's ability to cope with heat is sort of inversely proportional with the amount of damage which they are eventually causing. It needs to be collectively looked at as a larger societal threat rather than being looked at as just an individual thing where if people will deal with it themselves. I think we are at a time where everyone needs to come together and collectively act towards working towards building adaptive capacity and building resilient cities, resilient systems, and that sense of resilience in individuals as well to make a difference in the world.
With that last piece of hope, I think we can conclude this discussion. Thank you so much, Tamanna and Skandita, for taking the time and so generously sharing your findings, your insights, and what you've been doing all this while. And very grateful for you taking out this time. Thank you so much. I hope this conversation does the tad bit of taking this conversation forward. I hope it's able to contribute in some way or the other and add the richness that is required not only within the people but also in the policy circles to be able to consider this as urgent and to act on it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anirudh, for having us.
Thank you, Anirudh.